New York City, September 1948. Harlem after dark wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a living pulse, jazz leaking through open windows, neon lights flickering above crowded sidewalks, laughter mixing with the distant echo of sirens. But inside a modest restaurant on 135th Street, something far more powerful than music controlled the room. Wells' restaurant didn't look like the headquarters of a criminal empire. Red leather booths lined the walls. Checkered tablecloths covered small square tables. The scent of fried chicken and collard greens floated through the air like comfort itself. But anyone who mattered in Harlem understood one truth. This place wasn't just a restaurant. It was territory. And the man sitting in the corner booth controlled everything that moved through it. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson sat calmly, slicing into his steak with careful precision. Every movement felt deliberate, every motion as quiet but commanding. He wasn't loud, he didn't need to be. The entire room adjusted itself around his presence. Across from him sat his wife, Mamie, graceful, observant, radiating dignity that demanded respect without speaking a word. Around them, conversations flowed, dishes clinked, waiters moved quickly between tables. Politicians shared whispers in corners, musicians laughed near the jukebox. Numbers runners quietly handled folded slips of paper under tables. Harlem's economy, legal or not, moved through this room. The numbers racket, Harlem's underground lottery, pumped millions of dollars through the neighborhood every year. For many residents, it wasn't just gambling, it was survival. Rent money, grocery money, school shoes for their kids. And Bumpy Johnson controlled it all. That made him respected. It also made him dangerous, especially to people who believed Harlem should belong to someone else. Far downtown, powerful Mafia families watched Harlem like predators circling prey. They controlled most of New York's organized crime operations, but Harlem remained outside their reach. Not because they lacked guns, because they lacked loyalty. Bumpy didn't rule through fear alone. He paid hospital bills when families couldn't. He protected business owners from extortionists. He helped young men avoid prison when they still had a chance at redemption. To Harlem, he wasn't just a crime boss, he was protection, and that protection made him untouchable. But power like that attracts attention, dangerous attention. At exactly 8:47 p.m., the restaurant door opened. Cold air slipped inside first, then silence followed. A massive man stepped through the entrance wearing a perfectly tailored suit. Behind him came 6 others, coats hanging heavy in a way that made the bulges underneath unmistakable. They weren't there to eat. They weren't there to talk politely. The leader was known throughout Brooklyn and Manhattan as Salvatore the Butcher Bonaro, a man whose reputation was built on brutality. Stories about him didn't end with arrests or negotiations. They ended with funerals. Every fork in the restaurant paused mid-air as Bonaro walked forward without hesitation, his polished shoes tapping against the tiled floor like a countdown nobody wanted to hear. He didn't wait to be invited. He didn't acknowledge anyone else. His eyes locked directly onto Bumpy Johnson. The room's energy shifted instantly. Regular customers suddenly became silent witnesses. Waiters froze beside tables. Even the jukebox seemed quieter, like the building itself was bracing for violence. Bonaro stopped beside Bumpy's booth, towering over him, letting his shadow spill across the table. "Mr. Johnson," he said loudly enough for the entire restaurant to hear, "we need to have a conversation." Bumpy didn't look up. He simply cut another piece of steak and placed it calmly in his mouth, chewing slowly as if nothing unusual had happened. The silence stretched. Bonaro leaned slightly closer, his voice tightening. "I don't think you understand. My family sent me to discuss your business operations." Still, Bumpy didn't respond immediately. He reached for his napkin, wiped the corner of his mouth, and finally spoke, his voice low, steady, and unsettlingly calm. "I'm having dinner." A faint smile touched Bonaro's lips, but it carried no warmth. "That's funny," he said, glancing around the restaurant, "because from where I'm standing, this looks like a business meeting waiting to happen." Several patrons slowly shifted in their seats. A waitress quietly backed toward the kitchen door. Mamie Johnson's eyes never left Bonaro. Her stare alone could freeze the room. Bonaro placed both hands on the table, leaning slightly forward. He continued, "Let me explain something. The families downtown believe Harlem's lottery business belongs to them now. They're prepared to offer you a small percentage to step aside peacefully." Bumpy placed his fork down gently. The room seemed to shrink around that small sound. For the first time, he raised his eyes to meet Bonaro's gaze.
Calm, focused, completely unreadable. "That sounds generous," Bumpy said evenly. Then he paused. "But I'm going to decline." The temperature in the room dropped instantly. Bonaro's smile faded. "You're making a very expensive mistake," he said quietly. Bumpy leaned back slightly, folding his hands together. "I've made mistakes before," he replied. "This isn't one of them." Bonaro's jaw tightened, the air thickened, his crew shifted slightly behind him, hands hovering near hidden weapons. Then Bonaro leaned closer and whispered something that caused the entire restaurant to stop breathing, a word so loaded with hate, so reckless, that several customers instinctively stood halfway from their seats. The insult echoed across the room like a gunshot. Mame's fork slipped from her hand, striking her plate with a sharp metallic crack that rang through the silence. Every eye turned toward Bumpy Johnson, waiting, watching, knowing violence usually followed disrespect like that. But Bumpy didn't explode. He didn't shout. He didn't even blink. Instead, his right hand slowly moved toward his vest pocket, and that single motion made 6 armed men tense simultaneously. Because everyone in that restaurant understood something terrifying. When Bumpy Johnson moved slowly, that's when people usually died.
We'll reveal what Bumpy pulled from his pocket and why 6 armed mob soldiers suddenly realized they might not leave Harlem alive. Before the story begins, consider subscribing and joining us for more untold stories. The restaurant remained frozen in silence as Bumpy Johnson's hand slipped inside his vest pocket. 6 armed men instantly shifted their weight, fingers brushing against hidden triggers beneath their jackets. Chairs creaked softly as customers leaned back, giving space without daring to stand. The air inside Wells' restaurant felt heavy enough to suffocate anyone brave enough to breathe too loudly. Bonaro watched closely, his confidence steady but cautious. He had expected anger, maybe shouting, possibly gunfire. What he didn't expect was patience. Bumpy's hand emerged slowly, but it wasn't holding a gun. It wasn't holding anything modern at all. He placed an old-fashioned straight razor gently onto the table beside his plate. The polished blade caught the dim restaurant lighting, reflecting a thin silver line across Bonaro's face. Several customers inhaled sharply, not because the weapon looked threatening, because of what it represented. The razor wasn't just steel, it was history. Bumpy had carried that blade since he was a teenager running Harlem streets, building a reputation long before organized crime turned into corporate-style empires. Stories about that razor traveled through New York's underworld like whispered legends. Men who underestimated him rarely lived long enough to correct their mistakes. Bonaro stared at it for a moment before letting out a quiet chuckle. "You think that antique scares me?" he asked, gesturing toward his crew. "I walked in here with 6 professionals carrying serious hardware." Bumpy leaned forward slightly, folding his hands beside the razor. "You brought 6 guns into my restaurant," he said calmly, "and you believe that makes you powerful." Bonaro smirked, confidence returning. "It makes me prepared." Bumpy shook his head slowly. "No," he said, "it makes you unfamiliar with where you're standing." He rose from his booth with controlled precision, carefully folding his napkin and placing it beside his plate like he was finishing a formal dinner rather than confronting armed mobsters. The movement sent a ripple through the room. Several patrons straightened their posture instinctively. A cook peeked out from the kitchen doorway. A trumpet player near the jukebox quietly set his instrument down.
Bonaro noticed it. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his expression. Bumpy turned slightly, gesturing around the restaurant with a slow sweep of his hand. "You see these people?" he asked. Bonaro glanced around dismissively. "Customers." Bumpy's eyes darkened. "That man by the entrance," he continued, pointing toward an elderly janitor seated near the door. "I paid for his daughter's surgery when she was dying." He shifted his hand toward a middle-aged woman wearing a bright red dress near the bar. "That woman escaped a husband who thought violence was love. I made sure he never touched her again." Then he nodded toward the kitchen. "The kid washing dishes in the back? Police tried framing him for robbery. I found proof that saved him from prison." Bonaro's smile slowly disappeared. Bumpy stepped closer, his voice dropping into something quieter, heavier. "Every person in this room owes me nothing," he said. "But they stand with me because I earned their loyalty." A subtle sound followed his words, chairs scraping backward. One by one, patrons began standing from their tables, not aggressively, not dramatically, just quietly rising like soldiers answering an unspoken command. Bonaro's crew shifted nervously, scanning the room as 40 silent faces turned toward them. None held visible weapons, yet the calm unity in their eyes felt far more dangerous than bullets. Bumpy stepped closer to Bonaro, his height difference meaningless now. "You walked into my house with 6 guns," Bumpy said softly. "But you're surrounded by 40 people who would bleed for this neighborhood." Bonaro swallowed, his throat tightening despite his attempts to maintain composure. His men adjusted their footing, suddenly aware that every exit door stood blocked by ordinary citizens who refused to step aside. The razor still rested on the table behind Bumpy, untouched. That detail unsettled Bonaro more than anything else, because it meant Bumpy didn't think he needed it. Then Bumpy leaned slightly closer, his voice lowering to a whisper only Bonaro could hear. "You're going to apologize," he said evenly, "to my wife for the word you used." Bonaro's eyes widened slightly. "And after that," Bumpy continued, "you're going to leave Harlem and tell your bosses this neighborhood isn't available for purchase." And for the first time since entering Harlem, Salvatore Bonanno felt something he hadn't experienced in years: fear. The razor gleamed under the warm restaurant lights as Bumpy Johnson held it between his fingers, studying the blade like it carried memories only he could see. The quiet inside Wells' restaurant became unbearable. Even the sounds from the kitchen faded as if the entire building was holding its breath. Salvatore Bonanno stood motionless, trying to maintain authority, but something had already shifted. His crew remained armed, though their confidence was cracking beneath the pressure of 40 silent witnesses watching their every movement. Bumpy closed the razor halfway, letting the blade rest against his palm without fear. His expression remained calm, almost thoughtful, like a man solving a puzzle rather than confronting violence. Bonanno attempted to regain control of the moment. He straightened his jacket, forcing a confident tone back into his voice. "You really think your neighborhood loyalty scares men like us?" he said, gesturing toward his soldiers. "We run this city. We decide who stays and who disappears." Bumpy didn't respond immediately. He stepped closer to the table and gently placed the razor beside his unfinished steak, aligning it perfectly with the silverware. The simple gesture carried a level of composure that unsettled everyone watching. Then he turned back toward Bonanno. "You misunderstand power," Bumpy said quietly. Bonanno scoffed, though his voice sounded thinner now. "Enlighten me." Bumpy studied him for a long moment, as if measuring the weight of every word he was about to release. Around them, customers stood frozen, unwilling to interrupt history unfolding in front of their eyes. Then Bumpy spoke. 6 calm, deliberate words that seemed to drain the oxygen from the room. "Your uncle will bury you tomorrow." The sentence landed like thunder without noise. Bonanno blinked, unsure he had heard correctly. A faint tremor passed through his hands before he quickly clenched his fists to hide it. "You're bluffing," he said, though the certainty behind his voice had vanished. Bumpy tilted his head slightly, studying him with unsettling patience. "You walked into my establishment, you insulted my family, you insulted my people, and you believe your bosses will protect you after starting a war you can't finish?"
Bonanno's men raised their weapons fully now, barrels pointed directly at Bumpy's chest. The sudden movement sent a ripple through the restaurant. Several patrons stepped closer, blocking paths to the exits without saying a word. Bumpy didn't flinch. "You can pull those triggers," he said calmly. "You might even kill me." His eyes drifted slowly across Bonanno's crew. "But every person in this room will tear you apart before you reach the sidewalk." The stillness inside the restaurant became suffocating. Bonanno glanced toward the entrance, noticing 2 elderly men quietly locking the front door. Near the kitchen, a group of cooks stepped forward, gripping heavy cast-iron pans like shields. None of them spoke. None of them hesitated. Bumpy stepped closer, lowering his voice until it became almost intimate. "Even if you escape this building," he said, "Harlem already knows your face. Every street corner, every alley, every storefront, they belong to people who protect their own." Bonanno swallowed hard, sweat running down the back of his neck. He had faced gunfights, betrayals, and brutal executions during his career, yet this moment felt different. There was no chaos, no screaming, no rushing violence, only certainty. Bumpy extended his hand toward Mamie, his gesture gentle and respectful. "You're going to apologize," he said calmly. "Then you're going to walk out alive because I'm allowing it." Bonanno stared at Mamie Johnson. Her gaze remained cold, unshaken, and completely unforgiving.
Seconds stretched into something that felt like years. One wrong decision would ignite bloodshed that no one inside the restaurant would survive. Bonaro's finger hovered near his trigger, and for the first time in his violent career, he hesitated. We'll reveal the moment Bonaro makes his decision and how one apology forced the Mafia to reconsider starting a war with Harlem itself. Salvatore Bonaro's finger hovered dangerously close to the trigger, his breathing slow but uneven. The weight of 40 silent witnesses pressed against him like invisible chains. His men waited for an order, their weapons steady but their eyes searching for direction that suddenly felt uncertain. Across the table, Mamie Johnson remained perfectly composed. She didn't speak, she didn't react. Her silence carried more authority than any threat inside the room. Bumpy Johnson stood beside her, his posture relaxed, his hands resting calmly at his sides. He looked less like a man confronting violence and more like someone patiently waiting for an inevitable outcome. Bonaro scanned the restaurant again, hoping to find weakness, hesitation, fear, anything that might give him leverage. He found none. Instead, he saw cooks stepping further from the kitchen, gripping heavy utensils like improvised weapons. Waitresses stood shoulder to shoulder beside customers who moments earlier had been eating dinner. An elderly man near the entrance quietly rolled down the front security gate halfway, creating a barrier that could trap everyone inside if necessary. No one spoke. No one moved without purpose. Bonaro's confidence began collapsing under the realization that he wasn't facing one man. He was facing an entire neighborhood. "You think these people will die for you?" Bonaro asked, forcing defiance into his voice. Bumpy's expression never changed. "They don't have to die for me. They live for each other." The statement landed harder than any threat Bonaro had heard before. Loyalty wasn't something he could intimidate or purchase. It couldn't be negotiated or controlled. And standing inside Wells' restaurant, he finally understood that Harlem wasn't territory. It was family. One of Bonaro's men shifted nervously, lowering his weapon slightly. Another glanced toward the blocked entrance, calculating escape routes that no longer existed. Their hesitation spread through the group like a quiet infection. Bonaro noticed, and it terrified him more than Bumpy's razor ever could. The room felt smaller with every passing second. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen sounded louder. The ticking of the wall clock echoed like a countdown that refused to stop. Bumpy stepped closer, his voice lowering but remaining steady. "I'm offering you mercy," he said, "not because you deserve it, because my wife deserves respect in her own house." Bonaro looked toward Mamie again. Her expression remained cold, dignified, and completely unimpressed by his reputation. Seconds stretched painfully. Pride wrestled with survival inside Bonaro's mind. Walking away meant humiliation. Pulling the trigger meant certain death. Finally, his shoulders dropped slightly. He lowered his weapon. His crew hesitated, confused by the sudden shift, but slowly followed his lead. One by one, 6 gun barrels drifted toward the floor, their metallic movements echoing like surrender. Bonaro swallowed hard before speaking, his voice quieter now. "Mrs. Johnson," he began, struggling to maintain composure. "I spoke out of line. I apologize for what I said." The words felt foreign leaving his mouth. His men exchanged stunned glances, realizing they were witnessing something no one expected, their feared enforcer backing down. Mamie said nothing. Her silence forced Bonaro to sit in the weight of his apology without forgiveness or acknowledgement. The moment dragged longer than any gunfight he had survived. Bumpy gave a small nod toward the exit. "You're finished here," he said. Bonaro stepped backward slowly, refusing to turn his back until he reached the restaurant entrance. His crew followed carefully, eyes darting between the silent crowd surrounding them. As he reached the doorway, Bonaro paused and looked back at Bumpy. "You think this is over?" he said, attempting to recover a fragment of authority. Bumpy picked up his fork, cutting another piece of steak as if nothing significant had happened.
"Yes," he replied calmly. "It is." Bonaro exited into the Harlem night, his men following close behind. The door shut behind them with a heavy thud that echoed like the closing chapter of a war that never officially began. Inside the restaurant, silence lingered for a long moment. Then a single pair of hands started clapping. Another followed. Within seconds, the entire room erupted into applause, cheers, and laughter fueled by relief and pride. People embraced, waitresses wiped tears from their eyes, and cooks raised their utensils like victory flags. Bumpy simply sat down and continued his dinner, because to him, the real battle had only just begun. We'll reveal how Bonaro's humiliating retreat triggered an emergency Mafia meeting where powerful crime families debated whether eliminating Bumpy Johnson would start a war they couldn't survive. 3 nights after the confrontation at Wells' restaurant, tension traveled far beyond Harlem's streets. Inside a heavily guarded building in Midtown Manhattan, some of the most dangerous men in America gathered around a long, polished table beneath dim overhead lighting. This wasn't a casual meeting. It was an emergency council involving the most powerful mafia families controlling New York's underworld. Cigarette smoke floated thick across the room as low voices argued over one name, Bumpy Johnson. Salvatore Bonaro sat near the end of the table, unusually quiet. The bruises on his pride were far worse than anything physical. He avoided eye contact with several bosses who viewed his retreat as weakness, or worse, failure that could damage their authority across the city. At the head of the table sat Joseph Bonaro, Salvatore's uncle and one of the most feared crime leaders in New York. His expression remained cold, calculating, and dangerously calm. He had spent decades building influence through violence, manipulation, and careful alliances. Now his nephew had returned, humiliated. "He embarrassed our family," Joseph said slowly, his voice cutting through the smoke-filled room. "He disrespected our authority in front of witnesses." Several men nodded, murmuring agreement. Pride ruled organized crime as much as profit, and public humiliation demanded consequences. One boss slammed his glass onto the table. "If we let this slide," he said, "every independent operation in the city will think they can defy us." Another leaned forward, voice sharp with frustration. "We should move fast, send a crew into Harlem, remove Johnson before his influence spreads further." The room buzzed with violent suggestions, assassinations, territory invasions, financial sabotage. Each plan grew darker than the last. Salvatore remained silent, remembering the faces inside Wells' restaurant. The way ordinary citizens stood without hesitation. The way Bumpy never raised his voice, yet controlled every heartbeat in the room. Across the table, a different voice finally spoke. Frank Castellano, widely considered the quiet strategist of New York's underworld, leaned back in his chair, studying the arguments with patient calculation. He rarely interrupted discussions unless he believed someone was about to make a catastrophic mistake. "You're all thinking emotionally,"
Castellano said calmly. Joseph Bonanno narrowed his eyes. Explain. Castellano exhaled slowly before continuing. You're talking about killing one man, but Johnson isn't operating alone. Harlem supports him in ways we can't control. Another boss scoffed. We've taken territories before. Castellano shook his head slightly. Territories built on fear collapse quickly. Harlem isn't held by fear, it's held by loyalty. You remove Johnson, you don't inherit his business, you ignite rebellion. The room grew quieter as his words settled. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Your nephew walked into a neighborhood that sees Johnson as a protector. If we attack him publicly, we create chaos. Police attention increases, street resistance explodes, profits disappear. Joseph Bonanno remained silent, absorbing every word. Castellano continued.
We don't fear Johnson because of weapons, he said. We respect him because his people would rather lose everything than betray him. Several bosses exchanged uneasy glances. Organized crime thrived on fear and money, but loyalty built on gratitude created something far more unpredictable. Joseph finally spoke again, his voice lower now. So you're suggesting we do nothing? Castellano shook his head. I'm suggesting we adapt, negotiate, work with him instead of starting a war we can't contain. The suggestion hung heavily in the room. For men who built empires through dominance, compromise tasted like defeat. Yet every experienced leader at that table understood one truth. War with Harlem wouldn't be quick, and it wouldn't be clean. Salvatore finally spoke, his voice quieter than anyone expected. You didn't see it, he admitted. They weren't afraid, not one of them. The admission stunned several men around the table. Joseph studied his nephew carefully, recognizing fear hidden beneath honesty. The room remained silent as he weighed pride against survival. After several tense seconds, Joseph leaned back in his chair. Then we adjust, he said quietly. Harlem stays under Johnson's control, for now. Relief and frustration mixed across the room, but no one challenged the decision. Business would continue. Violence would wait.
Yet deep down, every man present understood something unsettling. Bumpy Johnson had forced the Mafia to reconsider their own power, and he had done it without firing a single shot. We'll reveal how Bumpy's quiet victory transformed Harlem's future, and why his influence became legend long after his enemies disappeared. News traveled differently in 1948. There were no viral headlines or breaking television alerts. Stories spread through whispers, late-night conversations, and word of mouth carried across barbershops, jazz clubs, and church gatherings. Within days, the confrontation at Wells' restaurant transformed into something larger than a simple power dispute. It became a legend. Across Harlem, residents spoke about the night 6 armed mob soldiers walked into their neighborhood and walked back out humbled. Mothers told their children about it as proof that unity could stand against intimidation. Business owners repeated the story behind closed doors, reminding each other why they paid respect to the man who protected their streets. Bumpy Johnson never celebrated the victory publicly. He didn't throw parties or boast about forcing the Mafia into retreat. Instead, he continued living exactly as he had before. He walked Harlem streets, greeted shop owners by name, and quietly handled disputes before violence could grow. That consistency strengthened his reputation far more than intimidation ever could. Over the following years, Harlem's underground economy expanded, but so did community support programs quietly funded through Bumpy's influence. Local businesses thrived under his protection. Young men who might have joined violent gangs found opportunities working legitimate jobs through connections he arranged. He understood something many crime leaders never learned. Control wasn't just about profit. It was about stability. Meanwhile, the Mafia families honored their decision to leave Harlem under Bumpy's leadership. They maintained business relationships, negotiated profits, and occasionally attempted to test boundaries through smaller operators. Those attempts rarely lasted long.
Word spread quickly that crossing Bumpy Johnson meant facing more than one man. It meant facing an entire neighborhood that refused to break loyalty for money or fear. Years passed, and new criminal figures rose across New York. Some attempted to challenge Bumpy's authority quietly. Others tried building influence through alliances with outside organizations. None managed to replace the respect he earned through decades of personal investment in Harlem's survival. Even law enforcement recognized his unusual influence. While they pursued illegal operations, many officers privately acknowledged that his presence reduced uncontrolled violence throughout the neighborhood. By the early 1960s, Harlem had changed. Social tensions, political movements, and cultural revolutions reshaped the city's identity. Through every transformation, Bumpy remained a symbol of strength, built through loyalty rather than domination. When he eventually passed away in 1968, Harlem didn't respond with quiet mourning. Thousands attended his funeral. Crowds filled streets, lined sidewalks, and stood silently as his legacy moved through the neighborhood he helped protect. Business owners closed their shops out of respect. Families stood shoulder to shoulder, remembering the man who paid medical bills, prevented evictions, and protected their streets when no one else would. Many powerful figures throughout organized crime disappeared without ceremony, their empires collapsing under betrayal or violence. Bumpy Johnson left something entirely different, a story people refused to forget. Historians and street legends would debate the truth behind certain events, exaggerate confrontations, or question alliances. But one fact remained consistent across every version of his story. Respect built his empire, and respect preserved his name long after his enemies vanished. The night at Wells' restaurant became more than a confrontation. It became proof that sometimes the strongest weapon a leader carries isn't force. It's the loyalty of people who choose to stand beside them. And decades later, Harlem still remembers the night its heartbeat refused to bow. If you enjoyed this dark, true crime-style storytelling and want more powerful untold legends like this, make sure you subscribe to Canon of Darkness, hit the like button, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story. Because the next legend we uncover might be even more dangerous than this one.